You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple. Hello, welcome back to Sweet Talk. This is your host, Adam Wild, recording from the Cornell University E-Line Maple Research Forest in Lake Placid, New York. Joining me from the Cornell University campus in Ithaca is my colleague and co-host, Aaron Whiteman. Hi, Aaron. Happy spring.
Hi, Adam. Happy spring. One of the things I love about sugaring is that it's not like the seasons for other crops that end in cold and the onset of the dull winter months. Instead, we get rewarded at the end of our labors with warm weather, flowers, and sunshine. How great is that?
Yeah, I totally agree. It is great. Nice to have the leaves out on the maples and lots of different plants blooming this time of the year. You know, Aaron, as we look back at this past maple season, the best way I can describe it, at least for the Lake Placid area, was that it was a roller coaster of a season. We had big fluctuations from abnormally warm and significant sap flow events to cold and completely frozen. And this happened for 2 full months or more.
Yeah, we had a strange season too. But in this area, it never got very cold and warm weather came way too soon. Our season ended on March 6th, which is the earliest I've experienced in all my years of sugaring. And I think the trend is increasingly clear that climate change is altering the rhythms of the sugaring season. And that's a question we get from the public all the time. The question of how is climate change impacting maple production?
Yeah, that is a question. I often receive that from both the general public and reporters, especially when we have those milder winters. It's a hard question to answer as maple trees are slow to respond. And another reason is that we don't have a lot of data yet.
Yeah, one maple season isn't enough to draw any firm conclusions. And honestly, it's hard to fully answer that question even with 10 years of data. But one thing we've done as an industry, whether we realize it or not, is adapt to climate change.
Yeah, I think you're correct. Some of the adaptations are more from a sense of improving production. But as a side benefit, we're adapting to climate change. I'm thinking of things like tap hole sanitation, higher vacuum, sap chilling. Most of these allow us to collect more sap during a shorter time frame, but also help to prolong the sap flow during warmer weather.
That's an interesting point. But a related question that we need to grapple with is whether maple is an environmentally friendly practice. The science is definitive. The global rise in carbon emissions is the main driver of a changing climate. Maple production can be energy intensive, and we use a lot of plastic tubing and jugs that also require energy to manufacture.
Yeah, but on the flip side, we're also tapping trees in a forest that, if that forest is healthy, is also sequestering carbon. In other words, it's taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into growth within the trees or other plants. But is this more or less carbon than we are emitting in maple production?
I think that's a great question, and it goes back to the point of needing to collect data to be able to make that determination. But that's an area that's outside of our expertise, right?
Yeah, I totally agree, Aaron. But fortunately, there are folks with better expertise in the field of carbon lifecycle analysis that are doing the work for the maple industry. And recently, I caught up with Dr. Geoff Lewis, research specialist, and Spencer Checkoway, graduate student research assistant, both from the Center for Sustainable Systems at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, to learn about the work they are doing to look at carbon emissions within the maple industry.
It sounds like it could be really useful for us in the maple industry to start thinking about the role we can play in limiting climate change. So let's have a listen to the conversation.
My name is Geoff Lewis. I'm a research specialist in the Center for Sustainable Systems at the University of Michigan.
I'm Spencer Checkoway. I'm a graduate student research assistant at the Center for Sustainable Systems at the University of Michigan.
Hello, Geoff. Hello, Spencer. Welcome to Sweet Talk. Great to have you both on the show with us today.
Thanks, Adam. It's great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
And I want to start out, a couple years ago, the Center for Sustainable Systems at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability received an ACER grant through the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service to conduct a carbon lifecycle assessment of maple syrup production. So to start out, in general, can you just explain to us what a carbon lifecycle assessment, as it may relate to maple or even other industries?
Sure. So basically what we're doing is an accounting of all the energy and materials that go into produce maple syrup, from, pulling sap out of a tree, collecting sap, conveying it to a sugar house, boiling, filtering, and bottling.
So kind of capturing all those different aspects. And why do you think it's really important to do a carbon life cycle assessment of maple syrup production? I think this is really the first time it's been done for the maple syrup industry. Why do you think it is important to do?
Yeah, I think it's, maple producers, I think, are very aware of their efficiency and cost. This is another metric that is becoming more of interest to folks in all industries, I think, is, what is their sort of carbon footprint? And, is there anything they can do to reduce it? And a lot of the things that we're finding, relate carbon footprint to efficiency and cost, but it's a way for folks that are interested in the carbon implications of their products to be aware of them and reduce the emissions by attacking the steps that are responsible for the biggest impacts.
And are you comparing that against any other sweeteners or any other products that are out there as kind of how does it stack up?
Yeah, ideally you could do that, but it's interesting to me because in the life cycle world, when you do comparative things, it's very important to compare basically apples to apples, right? You want to compare like things, and maple, as producers know, is a unique sweetener, right? And it has characteristics and qualities that wouldn't be captured if you were to compare it with corn syrup, say, right? Because everybody knows corn syrup and maple syrup are not the same thing. That's the challenge in that. I mean, it would give you some point of reference, but it would be, you'd have to be aware that they were not exactly comparable.
Yeah. Is there any concern that, again, I mean, you said that it's tough to compare these, they're not apples to apples, but are there any concerns that potentially maple syrup production is way more energy intensive or even just a little bit more energy intensive than some other sweeteners that are out there?
Maybe. It is the kind of thing you'd like to be aware of. But again, there's an aspect of maple production that isn't captured in the sweetener, right? You have the stewardship of this maple forest that is important for sugar makers to preserve and be a steward of, and if you're a corn farmer, well, your whole crop gets cut down every year, so there's a carbon sequestration story that is part of sugar production that doesn't exist for corn syrup or agave or something like that, right?
Yeah, so that culture and other aspects
right
kind of come into play at that standpoint then.
Yeah, but hard to quantify.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a little bit. I just wanted to clarify things a little more that you, from my understanding, is you've split kind of your assessment out into two categories. One looking at kind of the retail distribution of maple syrup, and the other one being the actual production aspects. What was kind of the reasoning for splitting those two?
Mostly it was the way that the task divided out neatly. And, we had a team of graduate students working on the sort of distribution and shipping part of it, and a master's student who is with us today, Spencer Checkoway, who did all of the production modeling. So it was partly a management decision, just to, we had to divide up the value chain somewhere. So that's how we did it.
And on thinking about just a little bit more on the retail distribution aspects, what were you including in that? Where did you draw the line? But what aspects in retail distribution is included?
Yeah, everything up to retail sale. So it's the bottle or the can or the jug, any other sort of materials that are used to ship it, pallets, cardboard, polyfilm, strapping, that kind of stuff. The transportation impacts by truck or car, and the distance that stuff moves from the sugar bush through a distributor to point of sale to retail.
Do you look at any of the upstream carbon emissions for producing that bottle or jug and getting it to your sugar house?
Yes, we do. Yeah, so there are a number of scenarios we looked at too, because some prefer glass, some prefer plastic. They weigh different amounts, so they have different transportation burdens. They come from different places in the world, so they travel different distances to get to here in North America. So yeah, it's all those upstream impacts. The materials to make the containers plus to get them here and full of syrup are all included in our modeling.
So I think an important question a lot of maple producers would be interested in thinking about is, what has more carbon emissions to maybe on the upstream side of it to produce and get it to you. And I guess maybe even on the distribution from the weight aspects, if you're looking at a glass bottle versus a plastic bottle.
Yeah. So plastic weighs much less than glass. So the transportation impacts are quite a bit lower for plastic than they are for glass. Glass tends to come from farther away. Lots of folks are purchasing glass from China. We also modeled Mexico and Eastern Europe. It's not so bad when they're not full, but they are heavy. But they tend to be the decorative ones, right? You get maple leaves and other creative like shapes and stuff in glass that you don't get in plastic jugs. They're more utilitarian and less expensive, probably, right? I don't know that much about that part of it.
It depends. Sometimes those decorative leaf bottles, because the glass is so thick on them, which makes them even heavier, but they're not always the cheapest bottles. It depends on the quantity you're getting and everything. But sometimes the more simple, larger bottles can be just as much as a smaller, more decorative bottle.
I mean, you're selling more of that the maple culture, with shapes like that in the container. So.
Yep. Yeah, and I think as you alluded towards, a lot of times the glass is coming from further away. I think I bought a bunch of the small 50 milliliter glass maple leaf bottles, and they had Poland on the boxes that they were produced versus, the plastic jugs are oftentimes made right in North America.
Right.
Yeah. So are you able to say one way or another? I mean, obviously it probably depends on size container and things, but are you able to say one way or another which tends to shake out, or is it?
Sadly, Adam, you'll get the standard academic answer. It depends. Yeah. It depends how far it's traveling and, where it's coming from and, all that kind of stuff. So it is pretty hard to say. They both have their virtues, right? And I don't think I could pick a winner.
Oh, okay. And so I think ultimately, that probably comes down to it depends on a case by case basis. And I think what you're ultimately trying to provide that data as kind of a calculator, right? For producers to be able to input and make their decisions based on that.
Yeah, that's correct. And I understand there's more going into it than just, carbon emissions. There's a cost thing. There's this culture thing. There's a lot of factors that go into everybody's decision on which containers to use. So basically, we're providing them that piece of information that's here are the carbon emissions associated with this type of container in this size coming from this source.
Yeah. So you're just trying to provide that information. People can make their own decisions based on that and not.
That's correct.
Which is best as an academic, right? We like to do that and not just say one way or the other, right?
Yeah, that's right.
More research is needed. That's another great academic response, right?
That's right.
And I guess just to back up a little bit and think about where's your data actually coming from? Where are you actually collecting that? Is this just hypothetical, or are you actually getting real-time data from maple production?
So we have a bit of both. When we started the project going on 2 years ago, my goal was to have it all be sort of driven by actual data that we collected. And it turns out that those data are actually pretty hard to collect. And maybe not a surprise to you, Adam, maybe. But we were fortunate enough to have a student on board who was keen to dig into model all this stuff. So we came up with a bunch of, we call them archetypes, but it's, scenarios basically of different producer sizes and production techniques and technologies. And those all went into us coming up with our estimates of emissions for producers.
Yeah, that's great. So, so thinking of that, let's shift kind of to the production side, which Spencer, you've been, spending a lot of time on. Are you finding that the biggest carbon emissions in maple syrup production comes from more the evaporation process, which I think is to be, expected? Everybody would think that's the case, or are there other factors that are maybe less surprising, that it's with the vacuum pumps or just running your heaters to keep your RO from freezing all winter long or something like that?
Yeah, so it's basically what you said. It's exactly what you'd expect. The boiling process, using the evaporator, putting all the fuel in, like that's going to be the biggest energy and carbon emissions sort of source. And as you start to get up to sort of larger sizes and larger scales, depending on sort of how that tubing system, that, the vacuum pumps, that might start to take over as you get really efficient. But I would say for pretty much everyone, it's going to be, boiling is going to be the big hitter.
Yeah, and you alluded to kind of larger sizes, and I believe you kind of determined that you needed to really split out producers into kind of this framework of different sizes because they're going to have different types of technologies and different efficiencies to calculate that, right?
Yeah. So when we were kind of looking through, we were splitting it up sort of small, medium, and large, and it was a lot based on what were the sort of the feasible technological decisions that you could make. So producers that are under 1,000 taps sort of have their own set of decision making. 1,000 to 10,000 kind of move towards fewer decisions, and then above 10,000 they kind of have the fewest amount of possible technological decisions because they have to be more efficient at that size. Just in terms of the cost of labor, time, they just don't have as much. It kind of converges on a handful of technologies.
Yeah, that makes sense. And have you found that certain size operations emit more carbon? Is it the bigger you get, the less carbon that's emitted typically, or is it kind of maybe in the middle, is less efficient than the top and the bottom?
Yeah, so I mean, on an overall basis, larger producers are going to emit more just in terms of the overall, but on a per gallon basis, which is what we were kind of looking at, smaller producers tend to just be less efficient, and larger producers tend to be very efficient. And so it really just goes, small producers tend to, have the most emissions and energy use per gallon, mediums right in the middle, and large, the economies of scale work in their favor. So
yeah, I think that's not too surprising. Do you have enough data yet to say how much carbon on average is emitted per gallon of syrup in the different size operations?
So from what our modeling was, so we kind of have sort of these bracketed ranges, and we were creating these archetypes. So I can't say necessarily from data, like from producer data, because everyone is so different. But I would say, it's about an order of magnitude larger for smaller producers than it is for larger producers. So you're looking at, larger producers might be in the range of like 6 to 9 kilograms of CO2 per gallon, and then smaller producers might be up in the hundreds.
Great. You didn't give me that depends academic answer,
No.
right? So,
but I will qualify it. It depends. It definitely depends. There's definitely a range, and we were modeling fairly conservative cases, so people that aren't necessarily the most efficient that they could be. So obviously, if you have a really efficient operation and you're utilizing your equipment really well, and everything that you are doing is sort of on that higher efficiency end of the spectrum, you can be way lower than that, 100 kilograms of CO2 per gallon.
Yeah, it's
more research to be done.
Yep.
Well, it's astonishing how much variability there is in producer practices, right? And the data we have collected from producers, and there have been quite a few who have been signed up to work with us and provide data on their operations. It's all over the place, right? In terms of what they're doing, and if you're building stuff on real data, you'd like to have at least 3 of each type of producer based on practices and geography and size, that kind of stuff. And we're not really that close to that number. And capturing that variability is something that by modeling it, having Spencer do the models of it, it's a lot easier to sort of understand what's going on than it is trying to pull something sensible out of all the variability in the data.
Yeah, I'm sure that's really been a challenge for you, even just comparing a producer who's in northern New York or northern Michigan versus southern Michigan or southern New York is going to have maybe different production levels, and at different times, different years. Last year, warmer regions did better, colder did not as great. This year, colder regions did better, warmer regions not as well. So there's a lot of components to kind of pull together there.
Yep.
And looking at that data, we're thinking about, especially on large operations that are doing a lot with electricity and reverse osmosis, vacuum pumps, and maybe even getting into evaporators a little bit. Are you thinking about the source of that electricity as well?
Yes. So that was one of the big things that we were looking at, was sort of what is the variability across, U.S. electric grids when it comes to, electrifying most of your operations. So if you're in West Virginia, you might be making maple syrup and you might try to electrify as much as you can. And, the grid is fairly dirty there as compared to something like Vermont, which has a very clean grid. And so looking at the impacts of that, both at sort of the production side, what the electrification looks like in terms of energy and emissions definitely varies from state to state.
Yeah. And thinking about, you've looked a lot, Spencer, at kind of the thermodynamics of the energy that it takes to take that sap and process that into syrup through evaporation and even through some stuff with ROs a little bit. If you were to purchase an evaporator yourself, what do you think is the most efficient from a carbon emission standpoint? I guess not even just energy, but carbon emissions.
That's actually a tougher question to answer, just from, in terms of heat transfer efficiency, something like an oil-fired evaporator might be the most efficient An electric evaporator is going to be the most efficient, but there's obviously going to be questions about, what is the color and flavor. So electric evaporators tend to be really efficient just in terms of the pressure and the heat that they're adding. Wood-fired evaporators tend to be the least efficient, but you're looking at sort of a different carbon source. So the story that you're telling is, if you're burning wood, it's on a biogenic carbon cycle. So, hundreds, hundreds of years versus fossil fuels with something that, even if it's more efficient, you're taking carbon that's been stored for millions of years and you're, putting it back up into the atmosphere. And so there's an efficiency gain from going to oil, but I would say in terms of the emissions, that it's hard to compare wood-fired evaporators to oil-fired evaporators to electric.
And are you trying to quantify that aspect of like that wood that came off your property, that's kind of that localized source versus that oil that came from wherever, and that is that, how many years that fossil fuel that's being burned? Are you quantifying that and trying to calculate and think about that separately, or is that just more of the story that comes out of it and the culture and aspects that we talked earlier?
Yeah, we're definitely quantifying that. Sorry to jump on your train here, Spencer, but it's becoming much more common in the life cycle world to treat fossil carbon separately from biogenic carbon, just because of what Spencer was just talking about, right? Yes, you're putting the same molecule into the atmosphere, but it's coming from someplace else, right? If you have a biogenic source, it's been in the atmosphere, it goes into a tree, it goes back to the atmosphere, it cycles there. And it's like, that's part of the maple stewardship story, right? But if you're using natural gas or fuel oil or coal in an evaporator, you're putting carbon into the atmosphere that hasn't been in the atmosphere for millions of years, right? So you could make an argument that that's a little more problematic from a climate perspective than using wood.
Do you think that, because this opens up a kind of a can of worms do you think regulators, you said the shift in the kind of carbon assessment is you're looking at that, but are the regulation when it comes to carbon emissions is taking that into consideration? I know that's been under debate and things in New York of whether wood is clean or not and burning. So do you see a shift in kind of regulation aspects?
I don't know. I think that's really tough to tell from, again, from an academic perspective. I kind of don't live very much in that policy world. We do try to inform decisions that are made there, but
you're not a lobbyist.
I'm not a lobbyist. Yeah, I don't have a dog in the fight. Yeah. I mean, my interest is in providing information that allows people to make better decisions and improve processes and products.
And kind of going back, Spencer, thinking about, maybe what's more efficient. But I think another thing to think about, and you probably didn't take this fully into consideration, but it comes down to cost too, right? Like, we could all probably want to eliminate our carbon emissions as much as possible, but where does the cost aspect play into that? And that makes it more challenging. And one that I was thinking about was like, even, you've kind of found that the steamaways, whatever, and preheaters, things like that, it does make it more efficient, but those are also an added cost. So at what point do they pay off?
Yeah, so we actually are starting to look at that right now. So the first piece that we sort of looked at was, what are the emissions reduction benefits that you get from each of these technologies? Now we're sort of looking at what is the real total cost of ownership of that and what would the payback be? And that also depends, obviously, if you're switching to something electric, what are the costs of electricity, where you're living versus, escalating fuel costs. But it definitely is a large upfront cost to get sort of these larger technologies like a steamaway or reverse osmosis. And that does need to be taken into consideration when you think about adding that into your operation.
And yeah, the other aspect too, Adam, for this one is, you talk about electrifying stuff, which is one of our, the things that comes out of our work is the value of electrification. But, we understand that a lot of these operations are not on a grid. They're remote locations. And if they're running a generator locally to, produce electricity to run their pumps or RO or something, that's a different emissions cost than using electricity from Quebec Hydro or something, right? So
yeah, it's true. It's like that meme picture that people send around of an electric truck with a generator in the back, charge it or whatever.
Right. So we understand there are limits, when we say you should electrify as much as possible, like that depends a lot on whether you have, access to the grid where you are.
Yeah. And a clean grid, I guess, in a way.
Yep. And we expect that the grids will be getting cleaner over time. Utilities are starting to to clean up a bit and, more quickly some places than others. But, we expect that over time that the electricity will get less carbon intensive.
Have you started to think about kind of that balance of energy savings, carbon emission savings on concentration level of running sap through an RO at, so the higher we take it in the RO, the faster it's going to go through evaporator, the more faster your evaporator is. But there is, I think you've kind of alluded to, there's a higher input cost on that RO to be able to go to, instead of just 12% or 14%, it can go up to 20 or 25%. But also there's more energy that's being used to remove that last little bit of water. And so from kind of a cost and energy savings, is it way more efficient to be at 25% than it is at 15% overall when you factor in everything? It's something that I've been thinking about. Have you found a magic number at all? Or is it the old, it depends?
I would say less of it depends. So the reduction that you get in terms of the amount that you have to boil off in the evaporation process, once you start to concentrate, it has sort of a 1/brix relationship. So you're going to get a lot more savings in that earlier stage. So if you just going from 2 to 4, you could save 60% in terms of energy cost just because of the energetics that go into having to boil off that water. Once you start getting up into that higher brix range, if you go from 15 to 20 to 25, you're getting less savings in terms of energy, sort of on a per brix basis. So I would say you should be able to do as much as you can do, as much as you can afford to do, as much as is sort of sized for your operation. There's not necessarily a magic number. I think it really just depends on what people can afford and what people can sort of fit in terms of the process flow stream they have going.
Yeah, I think it definitely depends on your operation, what size tanks do you have and all of that, and time factor comes into that as well. Yeah. But it is something that I find interesting to think about, where I think for a little while the industry was pushing the higher the bricks, the better, and there's been a little bit of back off on that. I think still, higher, but maybe not as much into the 30+% range through an RO.
Yeah. I mean, I would say you're always going to see a benefit. So I don't think there's necessarily a point at which you're going to concentrate to where you're not going to still see a benefit. It's more of just if you're trying to continue to, size up an RO, what is the cost of that to you? And I think the limiting factor is going to be cost more than necessarily energy or fuel costs at a certain point. So I think it really just comes down to what you can fit.
Yeah. And I guess I should have probably started this out in the beginning. So let's kind of back up and think about, why should producers even care about carbon emissions?
I mean, part of it comes down to the story that you're telling. I know there's, everyone should care about carbon emissions just because, you're on the planet and you should care about that. But in terms of being, a steward of a resource, you're looking at telling a story of trying to be sustainable. So sustainable in terms of a business year over year, sustainable in terms of trying to preserve the forest, and then sustainable in terms of the atmosphere. So you're trying to limit the amount of emissions that you're putting up there. And so I think there's a couple of levels to that are all very closely tied to the maple syrup industry. And a lot of the people that we've talked to cared about this before, the study even started.
Good.
When we're trying to recruit folks to help us with the study by providing data on their operations, we're getting folks that are interested in carbon, right? And we understand that that's not everybody that's out there. I believe that they're probably representative of producers in terms of their concern for efficiency and cost. And so I expect that using data from folks that care about carbon probably applies to people that care less about carbon.
I think so. I think the maple industry, just because it can be energy intensive, and from just a cost perspective, a financial perspective, it kind of forces people to eliminate carbon emissions through reverse osmosis and more efficient evaporators, because it's a smart business move, right? And it's not just because of a want to release less carbon. It a lot of times comes down to, and I think in the world in general oftentimes thinks this way, unfortunately, but it comes down to dollars and cents, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So thinking about, you had mentioned the kind of biogenetic fuels, so, wood. So, maple operations are collecting sap and sugars from trees that are managed to stay alive as living trees that are sequestering carbon. They're taking in carbon, they're storing that in growth. But, one could also make the argument that carbon is being put into sugar productions, which is what's in our maple syrup, right? And so maple syrup could almost go to the point of arguing that we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere and it's locked up in maple syrup, right? And so obviously there's a lot of energy, as we've talked about, that is expelled in carbon emissions through maple syrup production. Are you looking though at the total carbon emissions and taking into consideration the carbon that's removed from the atmosphere from our trees as they're growing?
No, I think is the short answer to that question. When you asked an earlier question about, what scope of our work was, and we talked about sort of, from sap out of a tree to syrup in a bottle, plus all the production of the stuff upstream and distribution to retail downstream. What's actually happening with the carbon in the trees is not part of our project. If we were to start doing, carbon balance of a sugar bush, then everything flowing out of it, wood, syrup, would all be part of that accounting. And that is maybe the logical next step to the project that we're doing under this ACER grant. And I know that there are others who are proposing work like that, not in the US right now, but.
So it's a big picture. This is step one of how much is being emitted. And then step two is.
Well, yeah, it's the obvious question that you just asked, right? That sugar makers care about. It's like, okay, we're quantifying emissions from production, but we're not quantifying sequestration in the woods, right? And that's the thing that people want to know is, they want the whole picture of carbon, not just the emissions. We're not trying to paint people as bad people because they're emitting carbon, right? Like you produce anything, you're emitting something. And we're just trying to give them information to make those processes more efficient and less carbon emitting. But ideally, you would have a more complete picture of the whole operation if you included the work that happens in the forest that trees are doing for you.
Yeah. And that's, I think really hard to quantify too, because, and it is in the emissions too, but every forest is different, right? Every trees are different.
Yeah.
If your trees are not as healthy, they're not sequestering as much, right? Or how, what other species are involved in.
And it changes through the season, right?
Yeah.
You sequester as the tree is growing in the spring, you are emitting dead leaves on the ground. You deal with biological systems, it's a lot messier, like dealing with sort of technology systems, it's sometimes quite a bit easier than dealing with living things. So
yeah, living things are really, really hard to quantify. There's a lot of depends come into play there, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, it would be nice for the maple industry to get to that point where we can say, what is that carbon balance? Are we negative or positive? And, do you think there's even a potential of having some kind of certification process that, much like there is for organic certification, that, and I think this is maybe happening a little bit more in Europe, right? Where you can get kind of like a stamp that this is a carbon friendly product, much like the bird friendly maple programs and things like that, or rainforest friendly coffee.
Right. Yeah, I would expect that there would be, something like that. The big question with all that certification stuff is it trusted by the public? Is it just marketing or is there science behind it? Do you trust it, basically?
Yeah, I think that's a really important part. And I think probably important for maple producers to think about, in that it's important not just to be making claims and that, well, our trees are sequestering carbon, so we're a negative carbon.
Yeah, and you're getting at one of the critical things about accounting for carbon. There's this concept of additionality. Is that sequestration happening anyway? Or is it a result of some action that I am taking? And if the trees would be doing what they're doing without you being there, it's not additional carbon. That would be happening anyway, regardless of whether you were there pulling sap or not. So it's harder to make the case that that's carbon that you can count against your own emissions.
Yeah, and that really opens up a whole can of worms in that whole kind of carbon credit market, right? There's this whole open market that's trying to buy from forest landowners their carbon credits, and they resell those to big corporations and individuals that can try to offset their carbon emissions because they're taking that from your forest. And so, how is it different for a maple producer doing that on their own land versus something that they've bought from somebody else that's just on paper?
Right. And the thing is, if a maple producer sells their carbon credits off their sugar bush, then they lose the right to use those as offsets for their own work.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you bring up, in that. And I think maple producers are starting to be approached about selling their carbon credits. And it sounds great, right? It's a way to make more money. And usually, they want forest land of trees that are not being cut. And that's typically a maple forest. But now you've basically sold, if you sold it off, you don't own that, right? And so you don't have that ability to offset your own carbon. So if you want to get to that point, and if there is some kind of legitimate science-based carbon certification process that say that you're carbon negative, you wouldn't have that ability if you've sold that off, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you mentioned one of the other big attributes that people look for with carbon stuff. Like I said, additionality, permanent is the other one. I think there are 4 qualities that people look for, and those are the big 2, additionality and permanence. So
yeah, are there other concerns that you have with like carbon credits at all? I know this is kind of outside of the scope of your project.
yeah, I think I do want to say something about it because I think it's evolving, maybe not rapidly, but not slowly either. Things are changing because there were a bunch of, at the beginning, when people started thinking of carbon credits as a thing, and they were investing in forestry and agricultural projects and investing a lot of money. And, it turned out that a lot of those projects weren't actually, you were paying basically in advance for carbon that biogenic material was going to be pulling out of the atmosphere. And a lot of it never happened. Many of the trees died or something. And so that's where the trust thing happens. They got a bad reputation. And once the trust is gone, it's sort of hard to get it back, right? And so people are changing how they sort of quantify and evaluate these programs so that you can do your due diligence and make sure that you're actually getting the reduction in emissions, the sequestration that you're credited for.
Well, yeah, and it also, it goes back to what we said in that the data is not fully there necessarily to quantify the negative balance that a maple forest or forest in general is taking in. And so I think a lot of gray area and a lot of assumptions are being made in the carbon market world, right? And that it's maybe not the best to get tangled up in right now. And that it's kind of a sort of a
Wild West.
It's a Wild West. Yeah, definitely. A Wild West market that there's not really any policy regulations around right now, but most likely my guess would be that's going to change in the next 10 years, potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are some, the Federal Trade Commission has this green guide, so if you're making environmental claims about a product, they have set out some rules for what you can say, what you can't say, that kind of stuff. It's not as detailed as, sort of regulations in a carbon market or tracing additionality or permanence or anything like that. But
yeah, and I think my biggest complaint about the carbon offset market world is that it doesn't do anything to reduce carbon emissions. It just helps kind of cover up for the people who have money that can then buy these offsets and allows them to keep polluting carbon, right? And doesn't actually force them to reduce, which is ultimately the better option.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, and to move back into the maple production world a little more, what are ways that you're finding that maple producers can potentially decarbonize their operations, or kind of some shifts in the industry that you think could help or you see maybe coming in the future?
Yeah, the biggest thing that we saw is reverse osmosis. If you can use an RO, you're going to cut down on your fuel usage. And so that's the fastest way to decarbonize. And I would say other aspects that can improve the efficiency of boiling, because we highlighted earlier that that's sort of the heavy hitter. Anything that you can do to make that more efficient, whether that be improving the efficiency of the evaporator, cutting down on the amount of fuel that you would need to burn, that's obviously going to have the biggest decarbonization potential. And then on top of that, the pieces that you can do tied to collection are really just going to be centered around a vacuum tubing system. So if you can put vacuum on a tubing system, you're going to be able to collect more sap. And so on a per gallon basis, you're able to utilize your equipment better in terms of the embodied emissions that are going into the operation. So that's sort of an interesting accounting problem, is like, you're putting all this equipment in and it has some embodied emissions and there's some, fuel use. And how can you maximize that in terms of the production?
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. And I think most producers probably don't think in that way, and that the more sap you get per tap, a lot of times you're going to be way more efficient from a total energy and carbon emission standpoint. If you're running that vacuum pump 24/7 through the maple season and you get 50,000 gallons of sap versus 100,000 gallons of sap, the same amount of energy is being put into that for that vacuum pump and all the tubing that's there for the carbon emissions for that tubing production, right, as you mentioned. And so it's an interesting thing to think about, in that being a good producer and keeping your production level up at the woods will allow you to actually reduce your carbon emissions in general.
Yeah, and a lot of the decisions that we're seeing about emissions reduction are just good business decisions. So, if you maintain your lines really well and they can hold vacuum, you're not wasting energy upstream. You're able to, produce more syrup. You're able to utilize your equipment better and have it pay off faster. And so these are all good business decisions as well as being good decarbonization decisions.
That's great. That's a great point. So with that in mind, are you still looking for new producers to help provide data?
Yes, we are. We're happy to have folks send us an email, give us a call, whatever. We've been working on our first years of data up to now. We're trying to produce some reports to send back to producers. So we promised everyone who participates with us to analyze their operation and give them a little report back to show them where in their process the heavy hitters are in terms of emissions. And if we have enough people, we can start looking at these categories of folks and do averages and show you where you stand with respect to the average producer in your sort of category. So yes, the more the merrier. We have one more production season to go. So if folks are interested, by all means, we'd love to hear from you.
Good to know that their producers are getting something in return.
Well, as you know, we're asking for a little bit of data, and I've discovered that maple producers are really good record keepers, so they have most of it. It's just a question of collecting it in the form we're asking for it in. And we wanted to be able to give something back for the ask that we're making. We see the project as a collaborative thing with the maple industry.
And just to clarify that any of the data that you collect, obviously you'll give a report back to the producers, but their farm name's not being tied to that data or anything that would associate them with that. And anything that's published is looking at more averages from productions, right?
That's correct. Yeah. No one will know except Spencer and me.
Yeah. How do they actually reach out to you if people want to get involved? You said email, or where should they go to find that? Or do you want to share that here?
They can go to our website, the css.umich.edu. My email is glewis, glewis at umich.edu.
Great. Do you have any resources available now from producers, or will you in the near future, of things that they can access on any information or any data so far?
Yeah. So hopefully from, the results of the study, we'll be able to have a calculator that I think will be hosted by that same website. And people can be able to, at any given season, plug in information that they have. They can see sort of the sustainability of their operation and where the inefficiencies may lie.
There are a couple of reports that we've produced as a result of that Spencer pulled together as part of his modeling efforts that are available on our website now that talk about thermodynamics of boiling syrup and tubing design.
Yeah, it's some neat information. I was reading through them lately. It's great. Well, thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Geoff, for this great information. It's been a great discussion, and I think hopefully we'll continue this in the future as we continue to look at some of these carbon emissions as you provide more data for the industry and as other projects come online. So thank you again for being here on Sweet Talk.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
Well, Aaron, I know that is a complicated topic, but I'm glad that Geoff and Spencer are doing this important work for the maple industry. What was your thought from the conversation?
Well, my initial thought is more of an observation of how intertwined the issue of climate change is with everything we do in maple. We depend on favorable climate conditions to grow healthy trees and collect sap. So it's in our best interest to limit carbon emissions. But on the flip side, it's hard to make and sell syrup without using a lot of energy. So it's a complicated issue to begin with. But it's also a highly important issue, and studies like this are a good first step in addressing the problem in an informed and strategic way.
Yeah, definitely is complicated, but we're at the kind of beginning stages of looking at this, and that's important. I think we, as maple producers and as a maple industry, should continue to think about and have conversations around this and look at ways that, we can try to reduce carbon emissions, or how do we take this into the future of marketing aspects, or are there ways that we can be more sustainable and get accreditation for that, right?
Yeah, I agree. This is really an opportunity to embrace change in some ways, but it's hard, right? Sugaring is steeped in tradition. And if I can wax poetic for a minute, like a lot of sugar makers, I kind of long for the days sometimes where you hear the quiet sloshing of sap in buckets instead of the vacuum pumps running in the background, or the fire crackling in the sugar house instead of the sound of the blower in the arch. We harvested firewood from the forest, and there weren't as many deer because people hunted. and trees grew back in the woods to replace the ones we cut down. So it kind of felt like everything was in balance back then. But it seems like the question now, because we can't really make syrup that way and be profitable, the question is, how do we find a new balance that kind of minimizes or eliminates our carbon footprint, but still holds on to the characteristic that sugar makers and customers love about the sugaring industry, the woods, the steaming evaporator, and the rustic feel of it. So that's the challenge, is kind of striking that balance. And part of that is looking at this question more closely, embracing new technology, and bouncing around ideas of how we can do things better.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on that aspect of culture, which the industry has changed in some ways, but there's still that culture of maple. And I think Geoff kind of brought that up, that we're selling the culture with maple as well. And so, that is important to make sure we keep that. And that, I think, can help distinguish us from other sweeteners or other products that are on the shelves. Consumers are most likely still going to be consuming sugars in some portion. And so, how can we stand out from the competition is looking at the culture that we can sell with maple. We're still tapping these intact native forests. We're not tilling up land and all of that. These are these native ecosystems that are great for wildlife habitat, bird habitat. We're filtering air and water. So that is an important culture, along with kind of the season of it, the small family operations most often. So there is that aspect to still kind of keep in there when we're marketing maple syrup.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things that we're already doing well that we can lean into as we try to solve this problem. Sugar bush management, like you mentioned, is a place where we can focus more effort and do what we're doing just a little bit better to sequester more carbon, keep our trees healthy and growing. And on the market side, one thing I can think of is a lot of local marketing, right? If we're marketing our products locally, there are less transportation inputs to get them to market. So that's a smaller carbon footprint. And a lot of people do a really good job of that already, getting their syrup on the market locally.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think another thing as an industry to kind of reflect on is that we have made a lot of changes that is making us more energy efficient. A lot of that came out of, necessity for just cost savings of, utilizing reverse osmosis and things like that save us a lot of money, save us a lot of time, but it's also really reduced that kind of energy consumption and emissions aspects, and especially the larger operations tend to kind of push there. There's certainly things that we can do in the future to get better, but I think we've come a long ways, which is great as an industry.
Yeah, reverse osmosis has been amazing, and I think that's solved a lot of the problem. And as was pointed out in the interview, now one of the biggest focuses needs to be that evaporation part. And it's a place where we can be pretty innovative, and we're starting to see that with some of these new evaporators, like the electric evaporators, people using steam kettles. You can even cook under vacuum to lower the temperature that syrup boils at. So there are a lot of things that we can play with to do this in a more energy efficient way. And that's something we should embrace, I think, and be excited about.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing I think Spencer hit on is the better producers we are, so the more production we're getting per tap, then we're kind of spreading those carbon emissions in the plastic tubing and the vacuum pump out across more gallons of finished syrup, right? And so being a better producer is actually going to be better for those carbon emissions in general.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of large operations and some of the more advanced smaller operations that are leading the way on this front, adopting new methods and new technology that really point the way of how we can do things better in the sugar house. So that's where it comes into play, where it's important to talk to other sugar makers, go to conferences, go on the maple tours and things like that, so we can all learn the lessons that other people have learned and apply them in our own sugar houses.
Yeah, definitely. There's always more things to learn and things that we as an industry can work on and improve. So I think it's one of those things we just need to continue having these conversations, trying to collect this data and applying that to the maple industry, and will change over time.
Yeah, and it sounds like Geoff and Spencer are just at the beginning of this work. So that's something we can probably circle back to in the future and learn more about their findings as they get further into the study.
Yeah, we'll continue this discussion on future episodes. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Sweet Talk, All Things Maple. Have a sweet day. Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, All Things Maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible with funding from the New York State Maple Producers Association and the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. All music is obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Have a sweet day.